Think about how it feels for a husband who can't sleep because he's tormented by our baby's cries every single night. You can't even handle household chores or childcare properly. You're such a half-baked wife. Aren't you ashamed, being a full-time housewife? If you want to start over, cool your head and come back. Despite it being deep into the night, my husband ruthlessly locked me and our 4-month-old daughter out of the house. Even when our daughter cries, he doesn't hold her, instead fleeing to another room. Every time he does that, he audibly clicks his tongue in annoyance. Even when I feed her or change her diaper, sometimes she just won't stop crying, and I get flustered. Instead of worrying about our daughter's well-being, I find myself worrying about my husband's mood. The fatigue after giving birth lasted longer than I thought, but my husband seemed completely indifferent. The man I once loved deeply had changed so much that I found myself feeling nothing towards him. My name is Catherine, a 28-year-old full-time housewife. After graduating from a vocational school, I used to work for a web company. But I quit when I got married. The man I married was Bob, who worked in sales at one of our clients. Since I was at the reception desk, we often met, and he initiated conversations. Being in sales, he was good with words, and since I was shy with little dating experience, I quickly fell for him. He often complimented how graceful I was, saying things like, "You're so beautiful, I just couldn't take my eyes off you." So, being naive, I pursued him, and we started dating. I was blindly in love with him, so I pretty much agreed to whatever he said. When he said he wanted to get married, I immediately agreed without giving it much thought. Ever since we were dating, he would say things like, "I'll be the breadwinner. I want my wife to focus on household chores." Or, "I want kids in 3 years. They'll take up these hobbies." And he had strong ideals about married life. I thought it was wonderful, so I felt happy to be with a dependable husband. In fact, Bob worked in a trading company, had a good income, and was climbing the corporate ladder smoothly. However, he's extremely concerned about keeping up appearances and demanded perfection in my housework. Bob had many friends, and almost every weekend, he'd bring colleagues home without notice. Those times were especially tough. Even when we were home, we couldn't relax. Some friends with bad drinking habits would make noise late into the night, making it impossible for us to have a restful weekend together. Still, it was better than him coming home drunk in the early hours. And when I became pregnant, he suddenly stopped doing it, which made me happy. Bob talks big, but I thought it might just be because of his job. I cherished the joy of our growing family every day. But after giving birth to our daughter, my life turned into a nightmare. Our long-awaited daughter was born 4 months ago. She's a cheerful and adorable child who has recently started rolling over. Bob is still very busy, often leaving Catherine and our daughter alone from morning to night. I was well aware of this, but Bob seemed to have no interest in our daughter. Unless I brought her up, we'd never talk about her. Even if she was sleeping in the crib right in front of him, he'd ignore her, and he'd even click his tongue if she started fussing at night. Some nights, I'd be so sleep-deprived that I wouldn't notice when she cried. On such nights, Bob would storm off to the next room, without even trying to hold our daughter. The next day, he'd inevitably lash out at me, saying, "Don't you have any parental awareness? The house is a mess, laundry is piling up, what are you doing all day? On top of that, you won't even let a tired man like me sleep. What kind of spite is this?" He'd then leave for work, stomping around, even if our daughter was still asleep. Who's the one lacking parental awareness here? I wanted to retort countless times, but I couldn't deny that both housework and child-rearing were falling behind. My in-laws, who visited us from time to time, were worried about this. "I'm sorry, I couldn't even clean up properly." I apologized as I served them tea. Both shook their heads. "Catherine, you're doing plenty for our son. We'll talk to Bob." And with such a cute child, it's understandable if housework falls behind sometimes. Bob just doesn't get a mother's heart. My mother-in-law especially stood up for me and called Bob several times. However, this backfired, and Bob's visits to his parents' house, which used to be monthly, dwindled. Amidst all this, I heard from my younger sister, Mandy, that she had quit her job and was returning to her hometown. "I haven't met your husband and child yet, so I'm coming to say hi." Mandy is my exact opposite, lively and vibrant. However, she's outspoken and would immediately voice her displeasure. I guessed that she probably had a disagreement with her boss or a colleague, as she has switched jobs for similar reasons before. I invited her over on Bob's day off. Knowing how headstrong both Bob and Mandy are, I was prepared to mediate if they clashed. Surprisingly, they got along like they had known each other forever. This caught me off guard, but I was relieved and watched them. However, Mandy didn't leave even as it grew dark. Bob casually told me to prepare dinner for Mandy too. I was taken aback. I had only prepared food for the two of us, and I wished Mandy had informed me earlier if she was going to stay. Not wanting to dampen their mood, I improvised and managed to prepare a meal for 3. Mandy scrutinized the dishes laid out. I had a bad feeling, and it turned out to be right. Is this nutritionally balanced? You've mixed Western and Eastern dishes, the colors are dull, and it seems like you've added more to make up for the small portion. Isn't it risky to eat like this when you're breastfeeding? I feel sorry for Bob and the child. She tried to look concerned, but a malicious smirk crept onto her face. The same mean expression from our childhood. This is why I've always wanted to avoid Mandy. See, Mandy thinks the same? I didn't say anything because she's my wife, but it's heartbreaking to think that the money I work hard for goes to meals like this. She acts superior just because she gave birth and doesn't even do the laundry or cleaning properly. The baby's crying is loud, and honestly, I'm worried about the future. Bob immediately jumped on the bandwagon, criticizing me alongside Mandy. Watching this, I felt something inside me crumbling. This is serious, isn't it? I've got some time before I find another job. How about I take over the housework for you? That's a great idea. This way, Catherine can easily take care of the baby she loves so much. Before I realized it, the two of them were staring at me together. Noticing that I was daydreaming, Mandy let out a deliberate sigh. You've always been like this, Catherine. You know you're not single anymore, right? I said I'm gonna help out with the chores from now on because I feel bad for Bob. We can't ask you to do that, it's a family issue. I wasn't expecting Mandy to stay this late, so I just whipped up whatever I had. We're usually fine, you know. I didn't know what would happen if my incompatible sister came to my house. Even though she's my real sister, I just couldn't stand her invading my space. You're the one who couldn't handle things. Stop making excuses. You should reconsider your role as a wife. My husband, feeling backed up, was even more sarcastic to me than usual. Mandy's frequent visits were pretty much forced upon us, and I felt choked by the situation. The next day, Mandy showed up early at my place. She had several bags in her hands, so I asked, "What's with all the bags?" "Just in case I end up staying over. Unlike you, Catherine, who knew I was coming and only prepared food for the two of you." She gave me that smug smile again. "Where's Bob?" she asked. When I told her he was at work, she looked bored and flopped onto the couch. Ignoring the bags she dumped on the floor, she began fiddling with her smartphone. I asked, "Aren't you gonna do anything? What's with that tone? It's unbelievable that you ask for my help and then act this way. Just do the visible chores, it's not that time-consuming. Don't you get annoyed always being told off by your husband, Catherine?" Hearing her response, I realized I just couldn't see eye to eye with her. What they call invisible housework is never-ending, and as a housewife, you don't always have the luxury to talk back when your husband criticizes you. But after 3 days of Mandy's presence, I got used to it and was less irritated. In fact, with Bob always in a good mood around her, even our daughter's nightly cries didn't bother me as much. That said, it was uncomfortable seeing how close Bob and Mandy were, even as siblings-in-law. But I feared that if I spoke up, they would gang up on me, so I held back. Since we stopped visiting our in-laws, they rarely reached out, leaving me without anyone to confide in. One day, as I was in this emotional limbo, a major incident occurred. Mandy almost dropped my daughter when she lost her grip. My daughter was terrified and cried out loud. I instinctively grabbed her from Mandy's arms. "Why did you touch her without asking? I'd never forgive you if anything happened to her." Mandy, who had never seen me yell before, seemed taken aback for a moment. But she quickly retorted, Your daughter wiggled, and I lost my balance. I didn't drop her, so why are you overreacting? She's not cute at all, just like you, Catherine. Maybe if she falls and gets hurt once, she'll understand. She spat out these unbelievable words about a 4-month-old baby and headed to Bob's room. Soon, I heard Bob's footsteps approaching. What's your deal? Both of you, get out. As expected, my husband yelled at me. Even as I held our crying daughter, he didn't care and kept shouting. You should be ashamed. After all Mandy's done for us, you're acting like this? Always pointing fingers at others for minor mistakes while not being able to handle your own duties? I didn't know you were such a despicable woman. I don't want to see your face for a while. If you really want to stay here, cool off and come back later. Without waiting for my reply, he pushed me and our daughter out the front door. I grabbed my purse, held my daughter, and got into the car. My daughter soon fell asleep in her car seat, perhaps lulled by the ride. I thought about booking a hotel for the night, but I had all her diapers and clothes at home. All the stores were closed, so I had to return home. After about an hour's drive over the mountain to the next town, I came back to our home. When I tried to unlock the door, I noticed a chain on it. Hearing the noise, Bob shouted from inside. You're back already? I'd like a quiet night for once without the baby's cries. I'm fed up with her crying non-stop as if you're trying to annoy me. Both of you, stay out till morning. I was in disbelief. How could he be so heartless, even to our daughter? If I'm going to be treated with such arrogance by a man like this, I'd rather struggle and live with just my daughter. Without responding to Bob's words, I got back in the car. As I left our driveway, I regretted not at least grabbing my daughter's things, but I didn't want to face the discomfort of running into Mandy at home. After checking on my daughter's sleeping face, I headed to a particular place. Driving through the nearly deserted streets of the night, I arrived about 30 minutes later at a place I used to visit frequently. Relieved to see the lights on, I knocked on the door. Catherine, who came out quietly, widened her eyes and exclaimed, "What are you doing here at this hour?" Soon after, Bob, looking surprised, also came out, but they both immediately invited us in. Perhaps sensing the urgency from my unexpected visit, they kindly provided baby formula and diapers for my daughter, even at this late hour. They had kept these items on hand to accommodate our family visits at any time, out of their sheer kindness. I felt guilty realizing they had kept them even after I stopped visiting. Seeing my almost tearful face, Catherine offered me a warm cup of tea. Bob, too, lovingly held my daughter, whom he hadn't seen in a while. I hesitated to share with these kind-hearted in-laws what Bob had done to me, but for the sake of protecting my daughter, I finally came clean. I told them everything since my daughter's birth, Bob's lack of interest in her, his running to another room in anger because her crying at night disturbed his sleep, and his and Mandy's ridiculing of me for not handling the housework or child-rearing. Their expressions grew grimmer. When I mentioned being thrown out of the house with my daughter that day, Bob exclaimed angrily to Catherine, "Call him. I can't believe he'd be such a fool as to kick out his wife and child at this hour." Catherine grabbed her smartphone and dialed Bob's number. But no matter how many times she redialed, there was no answer. Given Bob's sales job, he had once mentioned setting his phone volume loud, so he wouldn't miss any calls. Since he always answered my calls, even during our fights, it seemed unlikely he'd ignore a call from Catherine. Could he have turned his phone off? I tried to think of another way to contact him. That's when I remembered the baby monitor camera I'd synced with my smartphone. I'd often use it during cleaning or laundry, and since it was placed in the living room along with the crib, I could remotely check the living room situation. I truly wanted to know what Bob was doing. But what I saw live were the indecent figures of Bob and Mandy. A silent scream escaped my lips, yet a part of me felt it was somewhat expected. Their overly close bond as in-laws, their conniving ways, their mocking behavior, and knowing that Bob had a preference for women like Mandy were all clear. Despite not caring about Bob, my heart ached deeply. Determined not to let this pain go to waste, I began recording the footage. "Would you please watch this with me?" I asked Bob's parents. The moment they saw it, my mother-in-law collapsed into my father-in-law's arms. He was now pale, staring at the screen. As cruel as it was to them, I wanted a witness to what I'd seen. My father-in-law continued to call Bob on behalf of the devastated mother-in-law, but naturally, there was no answer. In the meantime, I called my own parents and briefly explained the situation. They immediately agreed to drive over, so we hastily decided to meet up. Of course, the meeting place was our home, now transformed into the love nest of Bob and Mandy. Just an hour later, my daughter and I, along with both sets of parents, stood in front of our house. Given the situation, without much greeting, I took the lead and rang the doorbell. As expected, Bob and Mandy, anticipating my return, ignored it. Keeping my calm, I rang the bell over and over. After a while, Bob finally opened the door with a lazy look. At that instant, both sets of parents barged in. My daughter and I followed suit. Bob panicked as the parents stormed in, looking pitiful in just a t-shirt and boxers.
Hey, what the hell is this?
Before I could respond, a woman's scream echoed from the living room. That voice, without a doubt, was my younger sister's. When I walked in, Mandy was sitting on the floor, dressed only in her underwear. It seemed like one of our parents might have slapped her. She was holding her cheek and tears were streaming down her face. My father-in-law grabbed Bob's arm and forced him to sit down next to her. Then the blame game began. Our parents scolded Mandy, and my in-laws lashed out at Bob. It was a barrage of harsh words like,
"How dare you try to replace your own sister? How could you leave your wife and daughter out so late? What if something had happened? Aren't you ashamed of yourselves despite being family?"
And so on. If only they had cried or apologized, it would have given everyone some relief, but their reactions were entirely different.
First off, how could you even call our parents and make them come all this way, Catherine? Did you set up a camera to spy on your husband? It's your fault for doing such a shady thing in the first place. You better apologize to everyone for invading our privacy. I can't believe there was a camera in the room. So, you never trusted me from the beginning, huh? After all, you've been comfortably living off my salary, playing the housewife, and now you pull a stunt like this? Our relationship is over, and it's all because of you.
To think that both of them would blame me like this, it felt like they had been taking me for granted. Deep down, I wondered what our parents must be thinking of me. The shame of having your own sister steal your husband is unbearable. I could feel tears building up, so I stared them down, trying hard not to blink.
I'm sorry for using the baby monitor in this way. I should have used it to watch over our daughter. But now I know that both of you are truly scumbags.
Upon hearing this, for the first time, Bob seemed taken aback. That camera was something we had decided to buy together when we found out I was pregnant. It was the first thing we bought for our daughter, but Bob seemed to have completely forgotten about it. He fell silent. But Mandy retorted, "So what? It's still an invasion of privacy. You always pull these sneaky moves, Catherine. It's obvious why I'm upset. You're so mean yet you snagged such a good husband. I'm also of marrying age, and I thought I could replace a clueless wife like you and find happiness. You're just after Bob's money, aren't you?" Hearing this, Mandy hesitated a bit. Without missing a beat, I continued.
Ever since I got married, you've been constantly asking about Bob's salary and bonuses. Both Mom and Dad had to calm you down back then. Weren't you always so obsessed with money? Is that why you're still single?
Those words seemed to hit her hard, and her face turned crimson. For Mandy, who was anxious about getting married, my remark about her being single was a huge blow. She snapped back, even more angrily.
Don't get too cocky just because you think you and your child are cuter than me. How much more do you plan to interfere with my life? Didn't you hear Bob earlier? He hates you too. So, everything would be settled if you were out of the picture, right? Don't you think it's pitiful for your child to have a single parent? I can raise her better than you, so just hand her over.
My sister approached aggressively, ready to grab me. Until now, I would have been intimidated by her aggression, but not today. With a sharp slap sound, she staggered backward. The cheek of my sister that I slapped turned red. It was the opposite side from where I had held her just moments ago.
Enough with belittling my daughter. She's not a toy for adults. If you want custody that badly, let's fight it out in court. My love for this child isn't something cheap and dirty. My mom and mother-in-law tried to calm me down, each from one side. Protected by our parents, my daughter and I decided to return to my family home temporarily. My husband sat on the floor, seemingly in shock, and my sister, perhaps tired from shouting, just glared at us silently as we headed for the door. Exiting the house, we reached the parking lot and said our goodbyes to my in-laws. We're on your side, Catherine. Things might get tough, but you can always lean on us. I couldn't hold back tears when my mother-in-law gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I expressed my gratitude to both of them. Weeks went by, which felt longer than I ever remembered. Until the court's decision came in, it felt like I was hardly alive. I had stood up to my husband and sister, but there was still the looming fear of being separated from my daughter. In the end, surveillance footage exposed the affair between my husband and sister. The divorce went through, and I got full custody. Through a lawyer, I demanded child support and a division of assets from Bob. Starting this month, he's scheduled to make payments little by little. My husband, who apparently had his student loans previously covered by his parents, had to start paying them himself. Due to this sudden financial burden, he called me in protest. However, I calmly told him not to contact me again since we were now divorced, and I stopped taking his calls. After that, the two got married. I reported the situation to my ex-husband's and my sister's companies. As a result, it seems my ex-husband became the talk of the office. Superiors who knew he had been married to me apparently gave him cold looks, making him feel so out of place that he supposedly resigned from his position. Due to my ex-husband's loss of income, the relationship between him and my sister worsened. My sister, now burdened with debt, seemingly called me as a last resort, seeking mediation with our parents and financial assistance. I patiently and cheerfully listened to her tale of woe, but I firmly declined. The divorce and relocation processes were made very smooth, thanks to the proactive assistance of both my parents and in-laws. Our daughter is now often cheered up by her loving grandparents, and she laughs more than she did before. We are about to begin a life as just the two of us, but there is nothing to worry about. I am confident that calm and peaceful days await us.